All right, we left off yesterday talking about exhaust systems, and the last thing we talked about was I said you should inspect internal welds and clamping every time the cowling is opened. And this is going to become especially true on turbocharged engines. So mostly we've talked about just normally aspirated engines, since there's not a lot of back pressure on exhaust systems, so things don't go wrong quite as often because it's free flowing. But when you add a turbocharger, you add back pressure to it, and that creates all kinds of different problems, which we'll talk about. So I said, let's see, and inspect external welds and clamping every time the cowling is open, correct? Okay, good. So I'm on the right thing. All right, so that was a D, so this will be E. E, we want to check also internal baffles. Check internal baffles. And so if we kind of looked at the inside of a muffler, I'll make a crude muffler, but at this point that's pretty much all you expect from me. It's some sort of crude drawing. So here we have our muffler, and inside of the muffler sometimes there will be cones with holes drilled in them. I'll make this one bigger. And what that does, it kind of acts as a flame arrestor. So if there's any flames, they may not come out. Muffler system or baffles the sound and stuff like that. But just like with you were looking at combustion cans for turbine engines, sometimes these things will break off. And pieces will break off and they will find their way across here and lay across here. And when this gets blocked, as the exhaust comes in and tries to go somewhere, it has nowhere to go, and so the engine dies. And so this is pretty bad, I would say. So you have to always look up with the flashlight in here at the mirror, make sure that there aren't any pieces floating around in there. So failure of an internal baffle can cause enough back pressure to stop an engine. So something to always look for. Something else that I must mention, and by the way, I know I've talked about this before, but I really want to push it, is the Faa Awards Program. They have it for both pilots, which is called the Wings Program, and AMT Awards Program for mechanics. And I remember when I applied to be a mechanic examiner, that was the first question on the application. I think it went even before your name. It was like, do you participate in the Faa AMT Awards Program, yes or no? And I don't have statistics, but certainly I've heard that people who are involved in the awards program do much better. They're safer, less accidents. But how many of you guys have tried this?
I'm enrolled. I haven't really paid much attention.
Yeah. So every year, the FAA has their big push, and they call it the core course. And I'm impressed with the quality of the courses. What they focus in on is always seemed to be relevant and important. And I think this last year, the year before, was all about exhaust systems. And that should tell you something. The FAA thought that, you know what, that's what we need to focus on this year. Of all the things they could focus on, was exhaust systems. Oh, it was one of the great ones. So anyway, I encourage it. V-band clamps. V-band clamps. All right, so V-band clamps are these things right here. And this is what happens when a V-band clamp fails. And so what happens is there's a little groove in here, and you have exhaust pieces that are, let's see, will kind of come together with a flange, and you have another flange like that, and the V-band clamp goes over all of this. And so what was happening is mechanics, well-intentioned, were putting the clamp on and then tightening this and calling it a day. Well, as soon as the aircraft started up and ran, the exhaust system would expand and contract and move and find its spot, and these V-band clamps were actually loose at that point. And what happens when these things fall off and move, this becomes a torch coming out, a very high pressure, hot torch that torches through anything it gets near. And usually there's fuel lines and various things that are near. And so once you start the fire, it's just all over with. So there's very important instructions. Lycoming's got some mandatory service instructions on how to put these things on. There's different instructions out there about putting exhaust on, but it isn't just put it on and torque. All right, number one, you need special nuts. Everybody in here is at Aero 300, yes? No, who hasn't had Aero 300 yet? Okay, so you guys have had Aero 300. What kind of nuts what happens to CAD-plated nuts when you use them on exhaust system? What? You were close. Well, first of all, do we want to use CAD-plated nuts with that nylon lock nut insert?
No.
What happens to the nylon? Melts out. Okay, so then we use a CAD-plated high-temp nut. What happens now? It's not dissimilar metal. Oh, I'm disappointed in you guys. It does change the metal. The CAD plating bakes into it and it gets super brittle. And the nuts sort of crumble. So you can't do that. So you have to use special exhaust nuts. And some instructions will say put the nuts on, torque them to a certain thing, run the aircraft, shut it down, re-torque. And you continue this process with follow the directions, and each one's a little different. But these, I think the newest way is you run it, tighten it, run it, tighten it, run it, tighten it, and you keep doing it until it stops tightening, right? Until you finally reach the final torque. And then you call it a day, and then you're done. But these right here are critical. So again, another example of how something that just seems so simple is actually causing significant problems.
Is it a bad practice to clamp fuel grounding clamps to the exhaust?
Well, I wouldn't clamp anything to the exhaust.
I see that many times.
Something's clamped to the exhaust?
Well, the grounding for the fueling.
Oh, I know what you're talking about. I'm sorry, I was thinking. Yeah, so when you're fueling your aircraft, you come up and so if you have never fueled an aircraft, I know you have. All right, so you ground the aircraft because, well, it creates a lot of static electricity, and then you walk up with a giant fuel hose and stick it in there, and it sparks, and then that looks like that picture there. So you don't want that. So when you fuel an aircraft, you actually ground it. And it's always funny that we don't do that with cars, but if you ever read the instructions, it tells you you're supposed to touch the nozzle or something to touch the car and ground it. But anyway, so yes, so where do you ground the aircraft?
I usually find like the chain hooks.
Ah, that's my boy.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
So a lot of people, because you don't want to scratch the airplanes, they don't want to clamp. It's a nasty clamp that you clamp to ground it. It's just a little stainless steel wire, and so you don't want to clamp it to the prop or something stupid like that. So what is okay to kind of scratch, and most people come up and they'll clamp it to the exhaust. I've never heard of anything bad happening, but on my personal airplane, what's the one thing on my airplane that's always scratched up anyway? It's those little hooks where you put chains on it all the time for the tie-down hooks. So since it's always scratched anyway, that's where I clamp it.
You also can't bond the airplane to a painted surface. So if it's painted over, you can't clamp it there.
That's correct. And the other thing I like about, wouldn't work for you, but when I clamp it to, I have a high wing aircraft, so when I clamp it to that, I can see it.
Yep.
So I forgot. You have a low wing. But worst case scenario, you taxi off and it'll pull off and just kind of no damage. If it's on your exhaust, it's too close to the prop for me.
I've also found that if you ground it to the exhaust, sometimes some exhaust pipes are too small, so you can't clamp it on there, so they fall off, so it doesn't work.
Yeah. So yeah,
Chain
that's
hooks always the best.
all right. So V-band clamps. Oh, I have a service instruction, so I'll just put use caution. Lycoming service bulletin 1238 Bravo was the last one I read. We won't go into that. let me see, never use galvanized or zinc plated tools or, and I bet you guys know this one, what else would I never write on? What kind of instrument would I never use to write? That's right, lead. Well, we call them lead pencil, but it's really graphite. Why not?
Because it's actually, graphite is carbon.
Okay.
And carbon is a hardening agent for metals.
Okay.
So it makes it
Like
great.
that. All right, installation of exhausts. Well, this is almost cheating to put this, but install per manufacturer. Instructions. Where would I find those instructions? You guys have put your engine up on the test stand and installed that exhaust system. How many of you followed the instructions when you did that? I have one guy lying in here. And why didn't you follow the instructions?
Because with the airframe,
Airframe. That's an airframe item. It's not an engine item. So it's going to be the airframe instructions. Same reason why you guys didn't have know how to put the prop on, because it's part of the airframe. So those are the kind of things where if you came and asked me, I'd say, oh, this is how you do it. No, but first of all, use the manufacturer's instructions. And then use proper gaskets. And nuts. Let me see. And I just talked about the fact that you want their special nuts. They're not CAD plated. It's too hot. The CAD plating bakes into the base metal. The base metal gets very brittle. I've taken off many exhaust systems where somebody has done that, and it's amazing. You put the socket up on there, and you go to loosen it, and it sticks, and then it finally pops, and then it kind of just disintegrates. And sometimes it's already disintegrated, and it's not there. That's why you're taking it apart, is to change out the gaskets, because you lost some of the studs. Install, let's use proper gaskets. Let's talk about proper gaskets. Proper gaskets. Okay, so you guys have spiral, this is the spiral wound, or sometimes it's called the no-blow gasket. These are pretty thick, and they're the more expensive, and in theory, the better ones. This is very thick metal. These right here, are very thin metal. And I have to laugh because I think this is one of the biggest mysteries in aviation for the longest time, because they are, if you look at the profile, there's this little bead right here, and make it look more, I didn't want all that. Pen. All right, so we have a little piece there, and then there's a bead, and then we have this over here. So this is just raised right here. You're supposed to use two of them. So I got two of them. And I tell you, the greatest mystery ever was, how do you put the two together? Well, you can make a sandwich. You can put them so the beads are opposing. You could probably put them so the beads touch each other. And there are no directions anywhere other than right here. And it's the only place I've ever found any directions on how to put them together. And so the correct way is this way. I've had people in the field, I think I went to a conference, and they said, oh, that goes this way, and put some high temp silicone RTV in between the two, make a little sandwich of them, and the beads go out. So I've seen that done. I've seen it. But anyway, the beads interlock. So beaded style, use the two beads interlocked. Bead goes toward the exhaust with smooth side toward the cylinder. So smooth side towards the cylinder. You might want to make a note of that, because someday you're going to want to know how to put these on, and just go, oh man, Kevin said something, but I don't want to. I know, I'll go watch the YouTube video. One of the things I try to remember is, what's the most expensive part, the cylinder or the exhaust? You'd think it would be, so we'll pretend like it is. And so I think the smooth side should go towards the expensive part. Well, if we really stopped and thought about how much an exhaust system is versus one cylinder, then the exhaust would be more expensive. But exhaust versus all of these cylinders, then all the cylinders would be more expensive. So the bead goes down towards the less expensive part, so it'll dig into the less expensive part. Or you can think about it, cylinders made out of what? Aluminum. And the exhaust is made out of stainless steel, Manel, and so that's harder, so it can take the little bead. I don't know. That's how I think of it. So that's how it goes. Discard. All right, back to here. So use proper gaskets and nuts. Install and operate engine to temperature. Last year, somebody was running their engine on the stand, and I was doing an oral, and it's a different sound coming through. Like something didn't sound right. I could just tell the engine was off. And I finally said, I gotta stop, go see what's going on. I walk out, and I'm like, there's something off on your engine. I can't quite place it, but the sound is distinctly different than it should be. So I had them shut down. I look, the exhaust was hanging down about an inch. Well, there's your problem. All right, so install and operate engine to temp, and then reposition to correct for any leaks. What's a leak going to look like?
Black switch.
Okay, black, or usually in aviation it's gray. It is from the lead. Yep. Very gray. And then torque and rerun as needed. So, torque. As needed. All right, that's all I'm going to say about that. Turbocharging and supercharging. All right, just like a lot of other things in aviation, like the difference between an economizer and a power enrichment, some of the wording gets a little confusing here with turbocharging and supercharging and various other things. So let's define amongst ourselves, if you will, some unofficial terminology. So I won't even write it down. So if we were talking about something, we can talk about the same thing and we know what we're talking about, all right? So if it's a turbocharger, it has a turbo on it. And then we'll define what a turbo is, but that's an exhaust-driven compressor that turbocharges something. And a supercharger is something that is not driven off of exhaust, but rather driven mechanically. So it's a mechanical blower, if you will, or a compressor that's mechanically driven. Got it? So you have turbocharger, supercharger. The problem comes, and that's universal, right? Everybody kind of, especially in the car world, that's the way it would work. It's, you got a supercharger. If you got a supercharger, it means it's belt driven, all right? But you get into aircraft engines that say they are turbo supercharged, and you're like, whoa, it's got both. It doesn't. And what they mean often is that if you say turbo supercharged, it's the difference between ground boosted and an altitude engine, or one that's turbo normalized. All right, so something that is turbo normalized, and I'll write a lot of this stuff down, but so turbo normalized is this. So here on one side you got an engine that is just normally aspirated, right? So that means it doesn't have a turbo and it doesn't have a supercharger, it has nothing, normally aspirated. Okay, So here it's sea level. And over here I've got a turbo normalized engine at sea level. And they both take off and they go to 1,000 feet. All right? So the engine that is just normally aspirated, it starts losing power, right? And the minute it took off, it started losing power. Go up in altitude. This one says, whoa, I'm at 1,000 feet, right? Goes up another. The engine thinks it's at 2,000. Every time it goes up more, the engine's doing what?
Getting richer.
Well, it's losing power is where we're going for this. Losing power, losing power. Okay, so a turbo normalized engine, it's sitting on the ground and the engine thinks, hey, I'm at sea level. And it takes off and goes to 1,000 feet, but it's got a turbocharger that normalizes it and says, huh, still 1,000 feet. And it goes up to another 1,000, and the engine thinks, cool, I'm still 1,000 feet. And so all the turbocharger does in a turbo normalized engine is keep the engine thinking that it's at sea level all the way up to what's called a critical altitude. And at critical altitude, the turbocharger is working so hard, it's exhausted, the tongue's hanging outside, and it can't keep up with it anymore. And then at that point, and we're talking, oh boy, it depends on the engine, but you're over 15,000 feet. And at that point, the turbo's working too hard, the air is getting too hot, and the turbo says, I can't, I give up. This is the best I can do. And then as the aircraft climbs up more, then the engine goes, huh, I guess we're at 500 feet now. But so that's sort of a turbo normalized. Now, then if you say turbo supercharged, like it's an engine that has a TSIO, turbo supercharged, injected opposed. So TSIO, when they talk about that, then it's more of a reference to, all right, so it's sitting on the ground, but it's already boosted. So instead of being at 30, it's at 31, 32, 33. It's already boosted. And so it's actually like a car is. It's the turbo's actually doing something right then and there. It's packing air in. So it's boosting the pressure up above atmospheric. So when you see the term turbo supercharged, it isn't both. Not that there aren't engines that wouldn't have both, but they would be old radial something or another that you'd have to talk to Prince about. That I wouldn't even know. He could tell you. Some esoteric one of. All right, so as a review, air and density. So at sea level pressure, on a standard day, is what?
29.92.
Okay, 29.92 inches of mercury. Or, how many psi? 14.7 psi. Speaking of psi, boy, I sure have a lot of trouble with this one. Nominal. What does nominal mean?
Normal?
Doesn't mean normal.
Ideal.
Nah, it's not even that. The example I've been using over in the shop is if I take a 1/2-inch wrench and it's got an opening on one side, right? If I say, what's that opening? Well, that opening is a 1/2-inch nominal. It means it's about, in this case, about 1/2 inch. If I measured it with a micrometer exactly, would it be a 1/2 inch?
Probably not.
No. And if I had a Snap-on and a Mac and a Craftsman and a Husky, they would all be a little different probably, right? But they all say 1/2 inch, so who's right, who's wrong? None of them. It's just a 1/2 inch nominal. In the same way we talk about that with a bolt. It's a 3/8 inch bolt, AN bolt. It's not really 3/8. It's 3/8 nominal. It means that's the ideal size there. So this nominal does not correspond to these two things. It just made me think of that because we're having problems in lab with the 1/2 inch nominal. Everybody goes, well, I think it's 1/2 inch normal. It doesn't say normal, it says nominal. Well, what does that mean? And so now you know. So it's okay. Let's see. What's temperature?
15 Celsius.
Oh, come on, man. In English. All right. So 29.92, and I will kind of round off to probably 30 inches, but don't let that freak you out. And let's see. Let's talk about Boyle's law. And that was named after
Boyle.
guy named Jeff Law. No, I don't know. Boyle's law. Guy named Boyle. Boyle's law says that any sample of gas, the volume is inversely proportional to the absolute pressure if the temp is kept constant, which is to say that if I have a container and if the temperature is kept constant, if I double the container size, what happens to the pressure inside? Half. If I half my container, the pressure doubles. Okay, that's really all that's saying. So I can write that. In any sample of gas, in any sample of gas, because I think there's a Q&A question that revolves around this. The volume is inversely proportional to that pressure. If the temp is kept constant. What happens if the temperature is not kept constant? In other words, I increase the temperature.
You're going to increase pressure.
You increase pressure. There you go. All right. Let's see. So 13 cubic feet of air at 14.7 pounds, 14 psi, I mean. PSI weighs 1 pound. Let me see. We don't need to memorize this. 10 psi, you need 15 cubic feet of air to equal a pound, and the same 15 cubic feet of air at 20 psi would be 2 pounds. So in other words, as we increase the pressure, we increase the density of the air. We know that, right? We've kind of been talking about this all along. And so as we go up in altitude, what happens as we go up in altitude?
It becomes less dense.
Okay, it becomes less dense. As altitude increases, pressure and density increase or decrease? What? Is that an increase or decrease? Decrease. All right, thank you. And as the pressure and the density decrease, we have less air going to the engine, which means we should have less what else going to the engine? Fuel. So we have less air and less fuel, then the horsepower is going to decrease. Okay. I think these numbers are kind of interesting. So I am going to write them down just so you can see. At sea level, that'd be 100%. I think I figured this out from a chart. So Pratt & Whitney 985, that would be a round engine. Has 450 horsepower typically. And so Pratt & Whitney has 450 horsepower. So how many horsepower would be at sea level?
450.
Okay, 450.
Nominal.
Nominal, thank you for that. All right, so at 10,000 feet, we have 75%. We're going to have the air is 75% is thick, let's say. So what is my horsepower going to be there? Well, it's 450 times 75%. So we are going to be so 337.5 horsepower. So how many horsepower do we lose? Loss of 112.5. I think that's correct. Yes, very good. All right, so let's take it up to at 20,000 feet. We are now at 50% atmospheric pressure. And that is going to bring us to 225 horsepower. That's a big loss, isn't it? All right, at 30,000. Do I do 30? Yep. 30,000 is 33%. We are down to 148 horsepower at 40,000. We are talking 25% atmosphere. We would be down to 115.5 horsepower. That is a huge loss. There's only one problem with my chart. Prince?
It's not word metric, or it's not like uniform value, like 33 to 25?
No, Pratt & Whitney 985 is supercharged. So, but it's supercharged. That changed things. I should have you do the supercharged. Supercharged. There you go. All right. So, just to give you an example, and I just picked an engine, but this particular engine, as I think about it, does have an internal supercharger on it. But anyway, so you can see what's happening as you go up in altitude, right? So this engine, or any engine I could pick that's normally aspirated, that 450 horsepower here at sea level, by the time I get up to 40,000 feet, it's down to 115 horsepower. That's a significant loss, I would think. All right? But through the use of turbocharging and supercharging, we can get it back, right? So if I could just put a device on it that compressed air, if I had big air compressor tanks that fed the engine, said, well, here's your 100% sea level air back. We're going to give you 14.7 PSI back, or 30 inches of manifold pressure back. Then if I could somehow go all the way up to 40,000 feet and still give it sea level air, what's my horsepower? 450. So now you can get all this horsepower out of the engine up in the air where it's thinner, and you can go faster. All right, so super fast. All right. Well, that's all great in a perfect world. We have to consider something. Heat has the opposite. Well, I don't want to say opposite effect, because opposite of what? I didn't really define that. So we'll just say heat also, that's better, also robs the engine of power. All right. So that brings us to Charles' law, which basically goes back to, if you take a container and if you raise the temperature of the gas inside of the container, then the pressure is going to increase. All right, so if temperature of a given gas, if temp of a given gas is given, I should say given quantity, gas is raised, and the pressure is held constant, the gas will expand in proportion to the absolute temperature. Well, now, is that a good thing? I mean, because if we think about it, well, shoot, all we have to do is heat up the gas, and it's going to expand, and then we have more gas, right? More air going into the engine. No? Well, it sounds like it. Why not? Why no?
It's the same quantity of air, just less volume.
It's-
More volume.
Okay, so how's another way we could say that? Because you're absolutely right.
You're taking thin air, heating it up, and making it thinner.
Okay, I've actually, or I can take a pound of air and I expand it. How much does it weigh now?
A pound of air.
Okay, and so ideally, as air is going through the fuel injection system or our pressure carburetor or whatever we have, is it want to know weight or does it want to know volume?
Volume.
It wants to know weight. I always want to know weight. So remember, that was one of the things about an AMC, automatic mixture control, was trying to convert into weight. So you always want weight. It's weight of air to weight of fuel. Does a carburetor measure weight or volume? Volume. There's our problem, right? If it could measure weight, then it would never get lean as we went up or rich as we went up in altitude, right? But we go up in altitude, we're getting the same volume going through it, but the air weighs less. Follow? So therein lies the problem. So if we heat up the air that's going into the fuel system, is that going to make it more or less accurate?
Less.
What do you mean by accurate?
Is it because I want to measure weight, not volume? And so if I have a pound of air that fits this and I heat it up, then it's now this, but it's still a pound. Okay, now that air has got to go through the carburetor, but the carburetor's going to go, whoa, look at all this air coming in. I'll just add enough fuel to make that work. But yet the air didn't weigh enough. So now it's going to run rich. So the more heat you throw into this, the more the air is expanded, the molecules are further apart, and the less useful the air is to us. It's like going up in altitude. And I've used this example before. Out here on a nice summer day. Did you fly today? I was wondering what the density altitude here today was. So we're at 75 feet. What were we, close to 95 degrees today? 92, density altitude. So actual altitude 75, density altitude here is probably around 1,000 or so feet. So any aircraft sitting out here that's normally aspirated, as they're getting ready to take off, the airplane is just thinking, the engine at least, I'm at 1,000 feet, and so is the propeller. Then it's going to perform like it was 1,000 feet, but where you're actually close to sea level, 75 feet. Why? Because the air had expanded. And so it wasn't as useful. What?
Is there ever a point
What?
where you lose power by using the turbocharger because of the amount of heat it produces?
Can you lose power from a turbocharger because of the amount of heat?
Yeah.
Absolutely.
As opposed to it just being normally aspirated.
Oh, so that's like saying, is there ever a time when a normally aspirated engine would be better than a turbocharged simply because of the heat factor?
If you were at sea level on an already hot day.
No. I would have to say probably not. Okay, so the question then is
Takeoff is supposed to be worse in normalized.
is worse than is it?
Yeah.
All right, well, there you go.
How could it so?
There's going to be a small amount of heat, and you're going to have some exhaust back pressure. But that's going to change very rapidly. And also the turbocharger's not working very hard at that point. It's the wastegate's open and it's off for the most part. It's not off though. They're never off. Never all the way off. All right, so, but something to keep in mind. So we can't just keep doing that. So in other words, hot air will expand, but I could write that. So in other words, we'll make that this point. In other words, hot air will expand. But weight remains the same. Hey, guess what? This is why, I like that, this is why we see a loss of RPM on a fixed pitch propeller when carb heat is pulled. Pulled on. I'll say pulled on because you pull on. Right? Say yes. So that's one of the drawbacks to turbochargers is they are a compressor. And what happens to air when you compress it? It gets hot. And that's why I showed you that picture the other day of this engine. What does this engine have to counteract that? Intercooler. But what's the problem with an intercooler?
It only cools it off so much.
Well, it's weight and drag. Not so, yeah. Well, actually, good point. There's actually going to be parasitic drag from the airframe because you have to have air coming in, so it's going to steal air. But it's also going to cause a restriction of airflow through the induction system, which means a drop in manifold pressure. That's simple. You just boost it more, right?
That's also a good thing to a certain extent because you need upper deck pressure for the injectors. So your manifold pressure can't be the same as your upper deck pressure.
Yeah, it can. That would be a nice thing. Manifold pressure can't be the same. Yeah, it can.
If you have fuel injected engine, you need a higher pressure for your.
No, you need higher pressure than atmospheric.
I thought you needed a higher pressure than your manifold pressure for your air bleed for your injectors.
Okay. So you do need more pressure than the manifold, but you don't need much.
Like 0.2 psi or something.
Well, I don't know the exact number, but
yeah, it just.
but you're going to get that usually through the throttle body anyway.
Yeah.
That adds a lot of restriction.
Okay, so I'm going to ask a weird question.
I would expect nothing less.
Okay.
Did I just preface it with I have no idea?
Okay. Maximum density of air.
What's that?
Maximum density of air, like how much you can compress.
Okay.
You don't know? Do you know?
What is the maximum?
Yeah. What is the maximum?
So where it becomes incompressible?
Yeah.
Somewhere way beyond anywhere that any aircraft could actually
I
do.
understand. Okay, so if you had
Because,
the ability to get air like absolute zero, for example,
okay,
and you had one that was naturally aspirated, then you had one with a turbocharger, a supercharger,
okay.
which would perform better at
Do we have to consider heat?
Well, yes, but if you were able to get it to absolute zero,
Because the problem is at some point the heat gets so much that it can actually light off the fuel going into the engine. But that's at like 500 and some degrees. So I don't really know the answer to that.
okay.
It's a very deep theory.
Okay.
What I picture is, how many people have had a chance to tour the 747 firefighting aircraft? What's it called? The Global Express?
The global.
Global Supertanker?
Yeah.
Okay, well, it's I don't want to get off on the subject. They use a very unique system. They don't drop retardant. They shoot it out with high pressure air. So when you go in the aircraft, there's these giant high pressure tanks. And that's one of the longest things in their turnaround time is filling up these high pressure tanks. I don't remember the PSI that they're running out of it, but I kind of envision you creating something that has these giant high pressure tanks and him feeding it up into this closed system. Short flight, but man, I bet he'd go fast. Is that what we're thinking over here?
Not really.
Uh,
I think it would be more efficient because if you can cool down air to really cold temperatures, like,
Yeah, if you could cool it down,
then you can get more difference out of it.
you absolutely could. Right.
At a certain point, though, you wouldn't be able to cool it down anymore because it would turn into a liquid.
Well, that's fine. That's almost as absolute.
I mean, for instance, your
If it's okay, I'm going to bring it maybe back down to where the rest of us are. We'll let the smart guys battle this one out at break. And so anyway, we're kind of back to the Q&A level here. So all right, so yes, and of course, not to be. There's a lot of people who are still like, this is why we see a loss of RPM when the carb heat is pulled on.
It must be the tank, the supertanker.
And they're like, I'm not even sure where that comes from. So we'll finish this point up here. So that is why excessive heat from compression, whether it be a turbo or supercharger, is not desirable. It's a detriment. So it lowers turbo effect and eventually can cause detonation. So if you had somehow a normally aspirated engine that's seeing 30 inches of manifold pressure versus a turbocharged engine that's seeing 30 inches of manifold pressure, but the one that's turbocharged had to go through a compressor and get compressed. Now the air is hot, and you have the back pressure of the exhaust. That's going to be worse than a normally aspirated. But those two things don't normally happen because as soon as you take off, you're going to start seeing a split. But I think that goes back to the question Tyler asked, is there a detriment? Yeah, there is a detriment because you have back pressure and heat. Let's see, cause detonation. Oh, here we go, compression. Compression causes heat, and if the air is hot enough, 500 degrees, the fuel will ignite. Compression not from the cylinders, but compression from the turbocharger or the supercharger causes heat. And if the air is hot enough, and hot enough is 500 degrees F, the fuel will ignite. And that's pretty hot. You don't want that. All right, so we will take a break.